Your menu is too traditional for the new direction of this restaurant. That's what Claire Donovan said to me when she called me into her office on a sweltering afternoon in Savannah. Claire, the new owner of Oakshade Bistro, had only owned the place for 3 weeks, but she already had opinions about the dishes I'd poured my heart into for 7 years. I'm Marco Rossi, 45 years old, executive chef at Oakshade, a place that was once a small eatery in Savannah, Georgia's Italian neighborhood. 7 years, I'd transformed it into one of the most respected restaurants on the southern coast. Not with flashy techniques or molecular gastronomy, but with honest dishes that reminded people of simple, profound things. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video. I sat on a hard wooden chair in Claire's small office, Savannah sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting shadows of sprawling oaks outside. Claire barely looked up from her laptop, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm, as if I were just a task to check off. "We need a new culinary identity," she continued. Her voice even, cold. Something more Instagram-worthy, more fusion, more exciting. I didn't respond, just nodded once, then asked, my voice calm. "When's my last day?" Claire stopped typing, looked up, her blue eyes widening, clearly surprised. Maybe she expected me to beg, to argue, to fight to keep my role as executive chef. But I don't beg. Never. Not for people who can't see the value of what I've poured my soul into. 7 years, I'd given everything to the dishes at Oakshade. 7 years refining the recipes my grandfather Giuseppe taught me in Tuscany, when I was a kid, standing on a wooden stool to see over the kitchen counter. Dishes like Chianti braised beef, melting in the mouth, infused with the deep aroma of red wine and herbs, like a song from the Italian countryside. Saffron seafood soup, each spoonful a journey to the Tuscan coast, with a touch of lemon to balance the shrimp's flavor. Olive oil cake, lightly crisp, soaked in orange zest, like summer sunshine and family memories. Those dishes made diners close their eyes, smile, as if rediscovering a lost piece of memory. But Claire didn't see that. She only saw photos not bright enough for social media, opportunities to attract younger crowds. She smiled, seeming relieved that I didn't resist. 2 weeks should be enough for the transition, she said, her voice softer, as if following a prepared script. "You'll need to provide detailed recipes for all signature dishes." I nodded again, but in my mind I knew the real recipes, the secrets I learned from my grandfather, would never be written down. They weren't on paper, not something to hand over to someone like Claire, who saw the restaurant as numbers and likes. "All right," I said, standing up, leaving the office without looking back. Down in the kitchen, I paused, breathing in the faint aroma of herbs and braised meat in the air. The sizzle of pans, the steady chop of knives, like a symphony I knew by heart. Daniel Hayes, my sous chef, adjusted the flame under a pan with the precision of a clock. Sophie Carter, the pastry chef, meticulously decorated plates, her hands swift like a painter's. Liam Brooks, the grill chef, stood by the oven, checking meat with the calm of a former soldier. They moved like an orchestra, rhythmic, harmonious, without a single misstep. They didn't know yet, didn't know the heart of Oakshade was about to be torn apart. I stood there, hand touching the cold steel counter in the kitchen, trying to memorize this moment. 7 years, I'd turned Oakshade from a forgettable eatery, with worn red velvet chairs and an outdated chandelier, into a place where customers lined up every Friday night. Not because we chased trends, but because my dishes told stories. A plate of braised beef was a memory of Tuscan afternoons, when my grandfather told tales by the hearth. A bowl of seafood soup was a reminder of days I ran on the sand, hearing waves crash. A slice of olive oil cake was my grandmother's smile, as she cut cake for the family. Claire didn't understand that. She only saw numbers, posts, profit opportunities. The evening service began. I worked as usual, but each plate, leaving the kitchen, carried a hint of heaviness. I seasoned the soup, adding a touch of lemon because today's shrimp were milder, as my grandfather used to do. I checked the olive oil cake, ensuring the crust was crisp, infused with orange. Diners smiled, raised glasses of wine, but I felt like I was saying goodbye. After service, when the restaurant closed, I sat alone at the bar. The only light was a small bulb overhead, illuminating the worn wooden counter where I'd talked with thousands of customers, now friends. I poured a glass of Chianti, my grandfather's favorite, and let my fingers trace the counter. The scratches, the marks of time, told a story of bustling nights, laughter, plates of food connecting people. I took a sip of wine, its rich flavor bringing back my grandfather with his kind smile and rough hands. Food is soul, Marco, he used to say. Don't let anyone take it away. I stood, turned off the light, and stepped outside. Savannah's air was humid, the scent of jasmine drifting by. The Oakshade Bistro sign glowed faintly in the dark, and I looked at it one last time, feeling like I was leaving a part of myself behind. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." Sitting in my small apartment that night, the glass of Chianti still half full, I let my mind drift to days long gone, when it all began. The loss of Oakshade Bistro weighed heavy, but memories of my grandfather Giuseppe, of those days in Tuscany, were like a faint light, guiding me through the darkness. I didn't come to Savannah intending to be a chef. I came to study engineering, to become the man my father, Lorenzo, always wanted: an engineer, a builder of bridges, of houses. But the kitchen fire, the smell of herbs, and the sound of a knife on a cutting board pulled me down a different path, one my grandfather had drawn for me when I was just a boy. I grew up in a small Tuscan village, where my grandfather Giuseppe ran a tiny eatery, just a few wooden tables and checkered tablecloths. Every morning I followed him to the market, my hand clutching his, smelling ripe tomatoes, hearing him haggle with fishmongers. "Choose with your eyes, but trust your hands," he'd say, placing a peach in my palm, teaching me to feel its ripeness with a touch. Evenings, I stood on a wooden stool in the kitchen, watching my grandmother stir a pot of ragu, the aroma of beef and Chianti filling the air. "Food isn't just food, Marco," my grandfather would say, his eyes sparkling. "It's memory, it's story, it's what makes people pause and remember what matters." Food in our family was never fancy, just flour, eggs, herbs, and the freshest market finds. But to my grandfather, they were magic. A plate of Chianti braised beef, melting in the mouth, was a tale of Tuscan winters, when the family gathered by the hearth. A bowl of saffron seafood soup, with a touch of lemon and tomato, was a memory of days he sailed with his father. A slice of olive oil cake, lightly crisp, infused with orange, was my grandmother's smile at family weddings. I learned from them that cooking wasn't just technique, it was a way to preserve, to love, to connect. When my family moved to Savannah, I was 15, carrying those memories, but not thinking they'd shape my life. My father Lorenzo wanted me to study engineering at the University of Georgia, to be useful. I tried, but the dry technical drawings never made my heart race like standing in a kitchen. I worked at a small diner to pay tuition, washing dishes, mopping floors, my heart stirring at the smell of herbs from the kitchen. One night, the line cook called in sick, and the owner, desperate, asked if I could help. I stepped into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and it was like finding my rhythm. That night, I made my grandfather's braised beef, and when the owner tasted it, he just nodded, saying, "You were born for this." 6 months later, I dropped out. My father was furious, didn't speak to me for 2 years. "You're throwing away your future," he shouted, his voice trembling with disappointment. But I couldn't go back. The kitchen was where I belonged. I worked in 4 different kitchens in Savannah, starting as a prep cook, learning from failures, like seafood soup, too salty, or olive oil cake, burnt black. Each mistake was a lesson, each dish a step closer to what my grandfather taught me. Then I came to Oakshade Bistro, a dying eatery with worn red velvet chairs, and a menu no one remembered. The owner, Walter Grayson, was ready to close when he gave me a chance. "Make food that matters to you," he said, his voice weary. "I'm out of ideas, so I did. I built a menu based on my grandfather's dishes. Chianti braised beef, simmered 6 hours with herbs and wine, like a greeting from Tuscany. Saffron seafood soup, learned from my grandmother, with a touch of lemon to brighten the shrimp. Olive oil cake, infused with orange, like a family gift for special occasions. Customers noticed, first locals, then critics, then tourists, reading about us online. Oakshade didn't chase trends. It was lasting, necessary, like a home. I sat there, in my dark apartment, the Chianti glass empty. 7 years at Oakshade. I'd created a place where diners didn't just eat, they felt. But Claire Donovan didn't see that. She only saw numbers, posts, chances to sell the reputation I'd built. I stood,
opened the window, letting Savannah's humid air flood in. The scent of jasmine drifted by, and I thought of my grandfather, of his old building in the Italian neighborhood, once his eatery. Maybe deep down, I knew this journey wasn't over. Maybe I'd find a way to bring those dishes, those memories, back. The next morning, I walked into Oakshade Bistro, feeling like I was entering a house about to be demolished. The smell of herbs and oven smoke was still familiar, but the air felt heavy, as if the kitchen knew what was coming. I started packing my personal belongings, the knives I brought from Tuscany, their steel blades worn from thousands of cuts, but still sharp as my loyalty to the craft. Daniel Hayes, my sous chef, caught me as I rolled the knives into a cloth. "Boss, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid of the answer. I looked into his eyes, saw the worry of a single father, who saw Oakshade as a second family. I told him about the meeting with Claire Donovan, how she fired me, because the menu was too traditional. Daniel's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. "The restaurant's doing better than ever," he said, his voice trembling. "This is your place, your dishes. People come for you." I shrugged, kept packing the knives. "It's hers now," I said, my voice steady, but inside, something clawed at me. Those dishes, Chianti braised beef, saffron seafood soup, olive oil cake, weren't just recipes. They were memories. Afternoons in Tuscany when my grandfather Giuseppe taught me to season with my heart. Nights when my grandmother told stories over a pot of ragu. They were my soul, and I wouldn't let Claire, with her social media ambitions, touch them. "But those are your recipes," Daniel insisted, stepping closer. "People come for your food." I paused, looked at him. "Not anymore," I said, turning away, not wanting him to see the pain in my eyes. Sophie Carter, the pastry chef, walked into the kitchen, flowers still on her hands from a batch of olive oil cake. She overheard us, her eyes widening. "Boss, you can't leave," she said, her voice almost pleading. "Who'll make the seafood soup right? Who'll know when the cake needs a bit more orange?" I gave a sad smile, remembering the evenings I taught Sophie to tweak flavors, to listen to the dish. Liam Brooks, the grill chef, stood dish, tweak flavors, to listen to the dish. Liam Brooks, the grill chef, stood by the oven, silent but his gaze steady, like when he spoke of his days in the military. "Just do your part well," Liam said, his voice low. "Like you always do." I nodded, grateful, but knew nothing could change Claire's decision.
I nodded, grateful, but knew nothing could change Claire's decision. Over the next 2 weeks I worked as if nothing had happened, but each day felt like a goodbye. I overheard Claire on the phone in her office, her voice carrying through the cracked door. "We'll keep the Oakshade name for now, but everything else changes. A new concept, a new chef, new energy." Those words cut like a knife, but they also made me realize Claire didn't understand Oakshade. She didn't see the value of the dishes that brought customers back week after week, of the stories told through each plate of food. I should have been prepared, but a part of me couldn't believe someone could destroy something that worked so perfectly, something so beloved. My final night at Oakshade, I cooked like any other night, but my hands felt heavy. I made all the signature dishes one last time: Chianti braised beef, the meat melting, infused with the aroma of wine and herbs; saffron seafood soup, brightened by a touch of lemon; olive oil cake, lightly crisp, soaked in orange zest. I tasted each dish, memorizing the flavors, though they were already in my blood. Diners smiled, raised glasses, unaware this was my last time in this kitchen. I said nothing, held no party, didn't want to make a fuss, just cooked, as my grandfather used to, as if the food would speak for me. When the shift ended, I left the keys on Claire's desk, along with a list of recipes, a simplified version, meant for health inspections and guiding line cooks. Not the real recipes, not the way I truly made them. I drove back to my apartment, opened a bottle of Chianti I'd saved for a long time, and sat on the balcony, watching Savannah's lights twinkle. No anger, no sadness, just an emptiness, where 7 years of work had been. I took a sip of wine, its rich flavor reminding me of my grandfather, and thought of his old building in the Italian neighborhood, once his eatery. As I stepped out of Oakshade, looking at the faintly glowing sign one last time, a sharp feeling stirred in my gut. Not quite sadness, something stronger, something telling me this story wasn't over. No way. Back at my apartment, Savannah's streetlights cast a glow through the window, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. I opened my grandfather's old notebook, flipping to the page with the Chianti braised beef recipe, his scrawled handwriting full of love. "The food remembers when people forget," he wrote in the corner. I traced my finger over the words, feeling like he was here, reminding me that the soul of those dishes couldn't be taken away. Claire could take Oakshade, but she couldn't take what I carried in my heart. I closed my eyes, picturing my grandfather's building, with its old brick walls and copper pots hanging in the kitchen. Maybe, just maybe, I'd start over, my own way. 3 days after I left Oakshade Bistro, my phone buzzed with a flurry of texts from Daniel Hayes. "Boss, everything's falling apart," he wrote, his tone frantic even through text. I sat in an armchair in my apartment, looking out at Savannah's twinkling lights through the window, the scent of jasmine drifting in from the humid air. I didn't reply right away, just opened the bottle of Chianti left from my final night at Oakshade, took a sip, and let the wine's deep flavor remind me of my grandfather Giuseppe. But Daniel wouldn't let me be. He showed up at my door, still in his kitchen uniform, hair matted with sweat, eyes gleaming with shock. "Disaster," he said, pushing past me into the room. "The new chef can't do anything." Daniel flopped into a chair, recounting everything. Claire Donovan had brought in a new chef, Ethan, from a trendy restaurant in Atlanta. Ethan was confident, full of ideas about elevating the menu, but when he tried to recreate my signature dishes, Chianti braised beef, saffron seafood soup, olive oil cake, everything collapsed. "The beef was tough as rubber," Daniel said, his voice bitter. "The soup was bland, no soul at all. And the olive oil cake? Hard as a brick." I shrugged, pouring Daniel a glass of water. "They have the recipes," I said, referring to the list I'd left on Claire's desk. The simplified version, missing the hidden details only I knew. Daniel looked at me, his gaze sharp. "They have what you wrote, not what you made." I wasn't surprised. Those dishes weren't just recipes. They were adjustments for the season, for instinct, for memory. Chianti braised beef needed an extra sprig of rosemary in the fall to cut through Savannah's chill. Seafood soup needed more lemon, if the shrimp came from the Gulf of Mexico instead of local waters. Olive oil cake had to bake longer on humid days to stay crisp. I didn't write those things down. They were in my hands, my heart, in the Tuscan afternoons, when my grandfather taught me to listen to the food. Ethan, with all his modern techniques, couldn't grasp that. Daniel went on, his voice lowering, as if sharing a secret. "Regulars noticed right away. Mrs. Margaret Ellis sent back the beef 2 times last night. She said it wasn't right, not the dish that reminded her of Italy." I paused, the Chianti glass suddenly heavier in my hand. Mrs. Margaret, who came to Oakshade every Thursday for 5 years, always ordered the beef. She told me about the year she lived in southern Italy, before her husband passed. "My beef," she said, was the only thing that took her back to those days. Hearing Daniel, I felt a pang, not for the food, but for the memories I'd given customers, now ruined. "They're planning a big relaunch next week," Daniel said, leaning back in the chair. "Critics, influencers, the works." Claire's calling at Oakshade evolved. I felt a stir in my chest, not quite satisfaction, but realization. Claire thought she could rebuild Oakshade without me, banking on the reputation I'd created. But that reputation wasn't in the restaurant's name, or the recipes on paper. It was in the dishes, in their soul, something she could never touch. I stood, stepped onto the balcony, looking at Savannah's flickering lights. "New chef, new restaurant," I said, my voice even. "That's how it works." Daniel shook his head. "Not like this, boss. Not when they don't have you." He left, leaving me with the Chianti, entangled thoughts. I didn't reply to texts from Sophie or Liam, who also messaged about the chaos at Oakshade. I turned off my phone, went inside, and opened my grandfather's notebook. The saffron seafood soup recipe appeared, with his scrawled note. "The food remembers when people forget." I traced my finger over the words, feeling like he was here, reminding me my soul wasn't in Oakshade anymore. I thought of my grandfather's old building, sitting quietly in the Italian neighborhood, with its peeling brick walls and copper pots in the kitchen. The idea of opening a new restaurant, called Rossi's Hearth, sparked, not clear, but powerful. I wasn't ready to say it, wasn't ready to act, but it was there, like the small fire my grandfather used to kindle in the Tuscan hearth. Claire could destroy Oakshade, but she couldn't take what I carried inside. I took the last sip of Chianti, its rich flavor evoking family evenings. The idea of Rossi's Hearth,
ignited in me like the small fire my grandfather Giuseppe used to kindle in the Tuscan hearth. But turning it into reality was a journey. After talking with Daniel, when he told me about Oakshade Bistro's collapse, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, Savannah's lights twinkling through the window, opened my grandfather's notebook, and flipped to the Chianti braised beef recipe. His scrawled handwriting, "The food remembers when people forget," was like a reminder. I'd given Oakshade 7 years. 7 years to build someone else's dream. Maybe it was time to build my own, in my grandfather's old building, once his eatery in the Italian neighborhood. The next morning, I drove to that building, sitting quietly among the neighborhood's bakeries and small cafes. The brick walls were peeling, the windows cloudy with dust. But when I pushed the door open, the smell of old wood and Italian memories flooded in. My grandfather's copper pots still hung in the kitchen, dusty but gleaming, when I wiped them clean. I stood there, hand gliding over the worn wooden counter, imagining a new restaurant, Rossi's Hearth, where my grandfather's dishes would live again. No Instagram needed, no flashiness, just honesty. But reality wasn't as simple as memory. I needed money for repairs, equipment, permits. The bank approved a loan, but with interest rates that kept me up at night. Permits were delayed by Savannah's complex regulations, and the old oven in the kitchen broke the day I tried to start it. I stood in the empty kitchen, looking at my grandfather's copper pots, wondering if I was dreaming too big. Then Daniel called. "Boss, I quit Oakshade," he said, his voice firm. "If you're opening a new place, I'm in." Sophie and Liam texted too, ready to leave Oakshade to start over with me. Their loyalty, like a warm glass of Chianti, chased away my doubts.
We gotta work. Daniel, Sophie, Liam, and I painted the walls, cleaned the windows, and fixed the wooden floor. I wrote the menu by hand, just 5 appetizers, 5 mains, 3 desserts, all from my grandfather's recipes: Chianti braised beef, saffron seafood soup, olive oil cake, and others like ricotta ravioli and herb roasted fish. No foam, no gels, nothing fusion, just real food, like my grandfather made. We chose red and white checkered tablecloths, set old wine bottles as candle holders, and hung my grandfather's copper pots, like a declaration. Each night, we tested dishes, the aroma of braised meat, filling the air, laughter echoing in the kitchen. "This is home," Sophie said, tasting the seafood soup. Not Oakshade. But Claire Donovan wouldn't leave me alone. One afternoon, as I painted Rossi's Hearth's front door, an envelope from her lawyer arrived. Inside was a warning, accusing me of violating a non-compete clause in my old contract. I couldn't open a similar restaurant within 5 miles of Oakshade for 2 years. Rossi's Hearth was just 2 miles away. I read the letter, my heart pounding, feeling like the building's brick walls were crumbling. I called Vincent Rossi, my cousin, a business lawyer in Savannah. Vincent came right over, took the letter, and flipped through it with a sharp gaze. "There's a loophole," he said after a moment. "The clause bans a similar restaurant. Oakshade is New American. If Rossi's Hearth is a traditional Italian restaurant based on family recipes, we can argue it's not directly competing." I breathed a sigh of relief, but still worried. "What's the risk?" I asked. Vincent shrugged. "She could sue, but their case is weak, especially since Oakshade's menu has completely changed." I nodded, but unease lingered. Claire had money, good lawyers, while I had only my grandfather's notebook and a team that trusted me. I didn't tell Daniel, Sophie, or Liam about the letter, not wanting them to worry. Instead, I focused on Rossi's Hearth, on the test cooking sessions, on the smell of Chianti braised beef filling the kitchen, on Sophie's laugh as she perfected the olive oil cake. "A bit more orange," I said, and she nodded, as if we were carrying on a tradition. One evening, sitting alone in Rossi's Hearth's kitchen, the candlelight from a wine bottle glinting off the copper pots, I opened my grandfather's notebook. The ricotta ravioli recipe appeared, with his note: "Cook with love, not haste." I traced my finger over the words, feeling like he was here, reminding me that food wasn't just food, it was legacy. Claire could try to stop me, but she couldn't take what I carried in my heart. I looked out the window, seeing the Italian neighborhood's lights twinkle, and knew Rossi's Hearth would be home, not just for me, but for everyone seeking something real. I stood, snuffed the candle, and locked the door. Savannah's air was humid, carrying the scent of jasmine and the hum of crickets. I thought of Claire's upcoming relaunch, the critics and investors Daniel mentioned. Part of me wanted them to fail, but a bigger part just wanted to cook, to bring my grandfather's dishes back, to prove that honesty always wins. I walked on, the streetlights guiding me home, and in my heart, Rossi's hearth burned brighter than ever. I was at Savannah's farmer's market, picking tomatoes for Rossi's Hearth seafood soup, when Walter Grayson, Oakshade Bistro's former owner, spotted me. He approached, holding a peach, his eyes pensive. "Heard what's going on?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, though I'd guessed some of it from Daniel's texts. Walter said Claire Donovan was desperate. She'd called him, asking if he had any notes on how I cooked in the early days. "She's panicking," Walter said, weighing the peach in his hand. "The investors expected the Oakshade you built, not what she's doing." I nodded, saying nothing, but inside I felt a stir, not satisfaction, but confirmation that Claire had been wrong to think she could recreate what I brought. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. They tried the olive oil cake for the 5th time. Still wrong. I smiled, though I didn't want to. That cake, with its lightly crisp crust and subtle orange scent, took me 2 years to perfect. Not just because of the recipe, but because of how I adjusted the flour for Savannah's humidity. How I steeped the oranges at the right moment. Claire and the new chef, Ethan, couldn't understand that. They had the list I left behind, but it lacked the soul of the dish, something never put on paper. Oakshade's relaunch, which Claire called Oakshade Evolved, happened soon after. Daniel, still working there to support his kid, recounted everything in a late-night call. "Disaster," he said, his voice weary. Critics came, seated at the VIP table, but the food was awful. The Chianti braised beef was dry, lacking rosemary, or the deep wine flavor. The seafood soup was bland, missing the lemon to brighten it. The olive oil cake was heavy as a rock, prompting one regular to leave mid-meal. Mrs. Margaret Ellis, who loved the beef, sent her plate back, telling the server, "This isn't Marco's dish." Daniel said the critics whispered to each other, scribbling notes, while Claire stood in the corner, face pale, forcing a smile for the investors. Claire didn't give up easily. One afternoon, as I checked the copper pots in Rossi's Hearth's kitchen, my phone rang. It was Claire. "Marco, how are you?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey, but I heard the strain beneath. "Fine," I replied, curtly. She paused, then said, "We're having some issues with the transition. I was hoping you could consult, just to smooth things out." I set the paintbrush down, looking at the candlelight from the wine bottle on the table. "What issues?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Some signature dishes aren't coming out right," she said, her voice fading. "Ethan's talented, but customers notice the difference. They have the recipes," I said, repeating what I told Daniel. Claire paused longer. "Yes, but some details are missing." I almost laughed. Details like how I add rosemary to the beef in the fall, or how I adjust lemon in the seafood soup depending on the shrimp. "I can pay you well," she went on, "and list you as a consulting chef." I shook my head, though she couldn't see. "I'm busy," I said. Claire's voice hardened. "Marco, the relaunch is in 3 days. Critics, investors. I need the food right." I took a deep breath, remembering my grandfather Giuseppe, and what he taught about food. "Then you shouldn't have fired the one who created them," I said, and hung up. 2 days before the relaunch, Daniel texted Claire was in the kitchen, noting every step Ethan cooked, asking about everything from onion cuts to oven temperatures, but it was useless. The food was still wrong, and the kitchen crew was so tense they argued in front of Claire. I didn't reply, focusing on Rossi's Hearth, on the smell of Chianti braised beef, wafting through the test kitchen, on Sophie's laugh as she perfected the olive oil cake. But deep down, I sensed Oakshade's collapse, not with joy, but with clarity. Claire had tried to take what wasn't hers, and now she was paying the price. I sat in Rossi's Hearth's kitchen, opening my grandfather's notebook, flipping to the saffron seafood soup recipe. "Cook with love, not haste," he wrote. I traced my finger over the words, knowing I didn't need Oakshade to bring his dishes back. Rossi's Hearth would be home, and I would do what I was born to do, just as my grandfather taught. The opening night of Rossi's Hearth, I stood in the kitchen, smelling the Chianti braised beef wafting, hearing the faint clink of my grandfather Giuseppe's copper pots, as Daniel stirred the saffron seafood soup. The small space with 12 tables, red and white checkered tablecloths, and candlelight from old wine bottles created a warm feeling,
like stepping into my grandmother's Tuscan kitchen. I wrote the menu by hand, just 5 appetizers, 5 mains, 3 desserts, all from my grandfather's recipes. Chianti braised beef, saffron seafood soup, olive oil cake, ricotta ravioli, herb roasted fish, nothing flashy, just real food, as my grandfather made. Daniel, Sophie, and Liam moved smoothly, like our old orchestra at Oakshade. But this time, they laughed more, as if they'd found home. Guests arrived early, mostly Oakshade regulars, who heard about my new place through Sophie's simple Instagram post. Mrs. Margaret Ellis walked in, hugged me, her eyes teary. "I've been looking for you everywhere," she said, her voice trembling. "Nothing's been right since you left Oakshade." I led her to a table, adding the Chianti braised beef to the menu just for her, as she loved. When she took her first bite, she closed her eyes, smiled, as if back in southern Italy years ago. Other tables buzzed, a couple celebrating an anniversary, a family laughing loudly, new diners curious about the new Italian place in the neighborhood. Each plate leaving the kitchen, tender beef, lemon bright soup, crisp olive oil cake, was a declaration that honesty still had a place. I didn't know a critic from the Savannah Morning News sat at the corner table, the same one who'd panned Oakshade's disastrous relaunch. We just cooked, as every night, with the love and precision my grandfather taught. When the shift ended, I sat in the kitchen, opening my grandfather's notebook, rereading his note. "Cook with love, not haste." I felt him here, smiling. The next morning, the review appeared. "The soul of Oakshade isn't gone. It just moved to the Italian neighborhood and found its true home." The phone rang nonstop. Bookings filled for 3 months. Rossi's Hearth, with just 12 tables and a handwritten menu, became a phenomenon. But Claire Donovan wouldn't let go. A month after opening, as I checked ingredients in the kitchen, an envelope from her lawyer was taped to Rossi's Hearth store, accusing me of violating the non-compete clause. My heart sank, but I called Vincent Rossi, my cousin, over coffee that afternoon. Vincent read the letter, smiling. "As expected," he said, "they have no case. Rossi's Hearth is a traditional Italian restaurant, based on family recipes. Oakshade switched to molecular cuisine, foams, gels, the works."
Oakshade switched to molecular cuisine. Foams. Gels. The works. They admit it's not the restaurant you worked at anymore. I sighed in relief, but still worried. Claire had money. Power. Vincent reassured me she has bigger problems, like selling a dying restaurant. A few weeks later, Claire appeared at Rossi's Hearth during a busy lunch rush. The restaurant went quiet as diners recognized her. She walked in, her gray suit gleaming, her eyes scanning the checkered tablecloths, copper pots on the wall, and laughing diners. Then she looked at me, standing behind the kitchen counter. I expected anger, resentment, but instead saw resignation, even a hint of respect. She nodded slightly, turned, and left. I never saw her again. Vincent called right after. Claire dropped the lawsuit, unable to pursue it, as Oakshade went bankrupt. Investors sued her for fraud, saying she sold a reputation that no longer existed. Oakshade closed, the building empty, a reminder of ambition without understanding. Amid it all, the biggest surprise was my father, Lorenzo. He called one evening, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Your mother told me about the new place," he said. "It's open, using your grandfather's recipes." I hesitated. "Just like he made them," I replied. A long silence. Then he said, "He'd be proud, more than having an engineer in the family." My heart tightened. He'd never said that since I dropped out. "You should stop by," I said, and he replied, "Maybe." He sent my grandfather's second notebook, an old leather book full of wine-making secrets I didn't know existed. "Your mother thought you'd want it," he said. One evening, when Rossi's Hearth was packed, Sophie rushed into the kitchen. "Someone wants to see you," she said. I stepped out, saw my father at the corner table. He stood, offering a handshake, but I hugged him, the first time in years. "This place is nice," he said, looking at the checkered tablecloths and copper pots, "like your grandfather's, with a few changes." We talked over dinner. My grandfather's ragu, the exact old recipe, about him, about food, about what I'd built. As he left, he handed me a key. "The vineyard in Napa Valley," he said. "Your grandfather left it to me, but it should be yours. Maybe one day you'll make wine as good as your food." I stood there, holding the key, feeling like my grandfather, my father, and I were together in Rossi's Hearth's kitchen, connected through the dishes, through a legacy that never fades. A year after opening night, Rossi's Hearth had become the heart of Savannah's Italian neighborhood. We expanded into my grandfather Giuseppe's main building, once his eatery, with its old brick walls and gleaming copper pots in the kitchen. The original small cafe still ran as a lunch spot, serving ricotta ravioli and Italian coffee, while the main restaurant welcomed evening diners with my handwritten menu. Every night, I stood at the kitchen door, watching diners, families, couples, Oakshade regulars, and new faces, laughing and talking by candlelight from wine bottles. The aroma of Chianti braised beef, saffron seafood soup, and orange-infused olive oil cake filled the air, a reminder that I'd found home. Oakshade Bistro, meanwhile, was history. I heard from Walter Grayson that the building closed for good, empty, like a monument to Claire Donovan's misguided ambition. Walter called one afternoon, his voice gentle. She sold it for half what she paid, he said. Now investors are suing her for fraud, saying she promised a reputation that's gone. I nodded over the phone, saying little. Not my business, I replied, though inside I felt a circle close. I didn't rejoice in Claire's failure. I didn't need to. The food spoke for me. I spent 3 days in Napa Valley, where my grandfather left a small vineyard. Standing among the rows of vines, smelling earth and leaves, I imagined making wine, the way my grandfather made food, with love, not haste. I brought the second notebook my father gave me, full of winemaking notes, from grape selection to harvest timing. Wine is the food of the earth, my grandfather wrote, and I smiled, knowing one day I'd carry on that legacy, not just through dishes but through Chianti bottles bearing the Rossi name. That night, after a busy shift at Rossi's Hearth, I sat alone at the bar. The only light was a small bulb overhead, illuminating the worn wooden counter where diners shared stories over plates of beef and glasses of wine. I poured a glass of Chianti, my grandfather's favorite, and ran my finger along the counter, feeling the scratches, the marks of time, like the years I spent building this place. On the wall hung a copy of the Savannah Morning News Review. The soul of Oakshade isn't gone. It just moved to the Italian neighborhood and found its true home. I read it again, not out of pride, but because it reminded me I'd done right, not to destroy Claire, but to create something real. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted to cook, as my grandfather Giuseppe taught, as my grandmother stirred pots of ragu, as my father Lorenzo finally understood when he sat in Rossi's Hearth and ate my grandfather's dishes. I wanted to bring dishes that made people pause, close their eyes, and remember what mattered. A family dinner, a trip far away, or just the feeling of being loved. Rossi's Hearth wasn't just a restaurant. It was home, not just for me, but for Daniel, Sophie, Liam, Mrs. Margaret, and every diner who walked through its doors. I took the last sip of Chianti, its rich flavor evoking Tuscan afternoons, when my grandfather told stories by the hearth. I raised my glass, toasting him, the empty chairs that would fill again tomorrow, and myself, for finding my path. Savannah's air carried the scent of jasmine, and I knew success wasn't revenge. It was doing what I was born to do, and doing it well. I turned off the light, locked the door, and stepped into the street, the Italian neighborhood's lights guiding me home, where my grandfather's legacy lived on, and would forever. The story of Marco Rossi in Rossi's Hearth reflects the values and challenges of modern life in the United States, where the pressure to chase trends and profit often clashes with authenticity and personal passion. Marco, a 45-year-old chef in Savannah, was fired from Oakshade Bistro for a menu deemed too traditional. But he didn't yield to Claire Donovan's ambition for Instagram-worthy dishes. Instead, he opened Rossi's Hearth, rooted in his grandfather Giuseppe's recipes, achieving lasting success through authenticity. Marco's journey, from loss to rebuilding, alongside his reconciliation with his father, Lorenzo, and his dream of making wine in Napa Valley, shows the lesson that true success comes from living true to personal values, even when facing societal pressures. In today's U.S. culture, where social media and trends often shape values, Marco's story teaches us to stay steadfast in our passions and roots. Just as Marco refused to write down the true recipes to protect his Tuscan heritage, we should cherish what makes us who we are, be it family traditions, professional skills, or personal beliefs, rather than chasing fleeting recognition. Claire's failure, with Oakshade collapsing for lacking soul, reminds us that profit can't replace quality and meaning. Moreover, Marco's reconciliation with his father, who once opposed his career as a chef,
underscores the importance of forgiveness and family connection in American society, where work can sometimes strain relationships. The advice is keep pursuing what you love, like Marco with Rossi's Hearth, because authenticity not only brings success but builds a meaningful, memorable life. Subscribe to the channel to follow the journey of honest dishes at Rossi's Hearth and discover more stories of culinary passion. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video with recipes from the heart of Tuscany.